Hi everyone, it's Nick again, back with another tier list. Today I'm going to be ranking the films of Paul Thomas Anderson. Paul Thomas Anderson is a modern filmmaker currently working. He has 9 films, of which I'm going to rank. But before I get into the ranking, please do me a favor and like the video and subscribe to the channel so you stay up to date on all new upcoming content. So I separated Paul Thomas Anderson's 9 films into 4 separate tiers. So let's take a look at the tiers. The bottom tier is called The Test Run, and I think this tier is meant for his films that he worked on when he was still trying to find his directorial voice and still trying to figure out what it means to be a filmmaker and trying to figure out what he likes to show in his films. So that's why I call it the test run tier, because he's pretty much working out his filmmaking style. He's basically doing his self-taught film school in this tier. The next tier is called the stylish tier. Films that are very high quality, that are very well shot and very well executed in the storytelling perspective. However, I find that I don't personally connect with them as much as I do his other films, but they're still stylish, so that's why it's the stylish tier. The next tier above the stylish is truly original. Now this is the tier for the films that I think you can't compare to any other film, because the writing and structure of the film is truly original to that of any other film I've seen, and I think these films in that tier really highlight that aspect of how unique of a filmmaker Paul Thomas Anderson is. So that's the reason why that's the truly original tier. And the last tier on the list is the personal favorites tier. Now this tier is pretty self-explanatory. It's my personal favorite Paul Thomas Anderson films, the films that I connect with the most. So starting at the bottom of the ranking, and the 9th film in my Paul Thomas Anderson ranking is going to be Hard 8.
Hard 8 is about a professional gambler named Sidney who teaches John the tricks of the trade. John does well until he falls for a cocktail waitress named Clementine.
This is Paul Thomas Anderson's first feature film. It came out in 1996. It stars Philip Baker Hall, John C. Reilly, Gwyneth Paltrow, and Samuel L. Jackson. It's about this odd relationship between John C. Reilly's character and Philip Baker Hall's character, where they kind of have a father-son mentor relationship when they cross paths, and Philip Baker Hall teaches John C. Reilly how to get good at gambling and create a sort of modest wealth for himself. From there, they develop a relationship and somewhat of a friendship, and that relationship is tested when Gwyneth Paltrow's character gets into trouble, and it also gets tested when Samuel L. Jackson threatens to reveal critical information about Philip Baker Hall's past to John C. Reilly. It's a very fine and very good film. I think why it's lower than the rest of Paul Thomas Anderson's films, it's because out of all of his films, it's probably the most slow and basic. Even though the film has very good performances, Paul Thomas Anderson doesn't take as many risks as a filmmaker in this film. His camera work is pretty standard and basic, and his story structure is also pretty surface level as well. I think this film is a good example of how you can build on the talents you have and how you can make a film a building block or a stepping stone for the rest of your career. We're now going to move on to the stylish tier. Now, in the stylish tier, the films, like I said, are very high quality, very artistic. However, I don't personally connect with these films as much as I do his other films. So that's why, even though I don't have a personal connection with them, I still think they're very stylish. At the bottom of the stylish tier, and the 8th film on the Paul Thomas Anderson ranking, is Inherent Vice.
Inherent Vice takes place in a drug-fueled Los Angeles during the 1970s, where a private investigator named Larry Dox Portello investigates the disappearance of a former girlfriend.
I do really love the colors throughout Inherent Vice, and I really love the film noir nature of the story. However, I find a lot of the story to be needlessly convoluted, even for film noir standards. I do enjoy Joaquin Phoenix's performance, and I love Josh Brolin's performance. I think he is hysterical in this film, and I love the bit parts that are given to really talented actors in multiple cases throughout the film. I also have to give a shout out to all the beautiful women in the film. I think that really adds to the aesthetic that Paul Thomas Anderson was trying to achieve in this groovy kind of 70s detective mystery. I don't find the narrative to be super compelling. I'm not really sure how I'm supposed to feel at certain parts, and I know Paul Thomas Anderson, when you watch the film, it's very clear that they don't expect you to follow along with all the information that's thrown at you, and you can appreciate in those moments the dense nature of the script, as well as the production design and elaborate blocking of the scenes, but you can't really enjoy the film as much as you'd like because you don't really know what story there is that you're supposed to latch onto and care about. For that reason, it's knocked down very much. I feel like if there was a pretty more fleshed out narrative that we can recognize and relate to earlier, then this film would be drastically higher on this list. However, if you enjoy Inherent Vice and you think it's his best film, I completely understand that. The next film on the stylish tier and the 7th film in the Paul Thomas Anderson ranking is Punch Drunk Love.
Punch Drunk Love is about a socially frustrated man named Barry Egan, who calls a phone sex line to curb his loneliness. Little does he know, it will land him in deep trouble and will jeopardize his romance with the mysterious Lena.
Punch Drunk Love is easily my favorite Adam Sandler movie. I really enjoy watching this film. I think this is the film where I first started to really recognize Paul Thomas Anderson's use of colors. He uses cool greens and blues and purples very effectively and very nicely in Punch Drunk Love. I also like the lens flares that he incorporates throughout the film. The story is very unique and odd, but that's, I think, where Paul Thomas Anderson is at his best. I really enjoy Adam Sandler's performance. I really enjoy his angst. I think he plays angst very well, and I wish he did that more often in his films. And I wish he got material like this more often because I think he actually is a very good actor. And I also think Philip Seymour Hoffman, this is one of his best performances. It's probably not his best performance, but it's definitely up there for me as one of his best. He's phenomenal in the film. The film has a very odd nature. It's a very enjoyable concept. It's a very enjoyable script. It's a character that we are at odds with at some times, but we ultimately root for in the end, which I find very compelling. It's simple yet surprising. You feel for the characters. Paul Thomas Anderson has dynamic camera work in this film, and the film is hysterical. Why it's probably not higher is just because there's less there in the film than his other films. I feel like his other films, like I keep saying, are more elaborate and take more risks and connect to you in a way that Punch Drunk Love tries to, but doesn't quite get there. But if you like Punch Drunk Love, I'm right there with you. The next film on the stylish tier and the 6th film in the Paul Thomas Anderson ranking is Phantom Thread.
Phantom Thread is set in the 1950s. It takes place in London. It's about Reynolds Woodcock, who is a renowned dressmaker whose fastidious life is disrupted by a young, strong-willed woman, Alma, who becomes his muse and lover.
I love the costumes in Phantom Thread. It won the Oscar for Best Costumes, and I think that was very well deserved. I enjoy Daniel Day-Lewis's and Leslie Manville's performances immensely, especially that scene that the two of them share at the dinner table near the end of the film. I really enjoy the interior architecture and design of his house. I think that was very well crafted in terms of production design. I really enjoy the romance that's involved in the story, and I love the passion between the characters, and the scenes that the characters have in this film is dynamite. I have a hard time wrapping myself around the concept of what happens throughout the story, where she thinks it's a good idea and it helps their relationship for her to poison him so that she can nurse him and take care of him in that way, because that's the only time that they're able to love each other, because whenever he's healthy, then they're at odds with each other, which sounds like the definition of a toxic relationship. The story is very sophisticated, and that's probably why I have it higher than the other films that we just went through, is because I really appreciate a sophisticated story that tries to have maturity behind it, even though the subject matter and the characters' outcomes and motivations might feel a little taboo. They ground it with the sophisticated characters and setting of the story, which I think is very effective. So if you haven't seen Phantom Thread, I highly recommend you go check it out. It's fantastic. So the next film, the final film on the stylish tier, and the fifth film in the Paul Thomas Anderson ranking is Licorice Pizza. Licorice Pizza is the story of Alana Kane and Gary Valentine growing up, running around, and going through the treacherous navigation of first love in the San Fernando Valley, 1973. A lot of people didn't really care for this movie when it came out, and I quite enjoyed it actually. What surprised me the most is that the film is told in vignettes, and what I mean by that is Alana and Gary go through a lot of different plots and adventures throughout the story, but they don't necessarily connect to each other than the fact that Alana and Gary go through it together. So there is one time where Alana and Gary are with Bradley Cooper at his house installing a waterbed, and there's a time where Alana is working in politics and Gary has his own pinball shop, or Gary is an aspiring actor and Alana is a photographer at a high school. So they jump around to different odd jobs and different adventures, but they do it together, or when they're separated, they care about each other. But the stuff that they do throughout the film doesn't reoccur later on in the film. It kind of starts and stops, and then the next story happens. That could be a criticism of the film. You might think it's a good thing about the film. For me, I have a mixed feeling about it. Sometimes I enjoy it. Sometimes I wish there was a more connective tissue to the story. But I find the performances from Alana Haim and Cooper Hoffman to be very charming. I buy their relationship because of their performances. I don't condone it, but I buy it. I want to make that clarification. The film has an exuberance of youth, and I really enjoy the colors and the soundtrack to the film, especially the David Bowie songs that I heard. I just feel like the vibes in this film are probably the best part about it. It just feels fun, like you're having a good time. You can't really complain because the characters are having so much fun. The camera work is sharp. The colors are fun. The performances are big. The relationship is honest. The subject matter is taboo, which is once again something Paul Thomas Anderson is very good at. I just really enjoy the film. It's better than the other films on the list because it's carefree and fun, but it also has a warm center to it. It's fun and cool, but it's not overly convoluted. So that's why it's above the other films on the list. Why it's not in the upper half of the list is because I personally didn't have a strong connection to the film like I do the other films, like I keep saying. The other films just grab me more. Like, this film is good, but it is a bunch of vignettes about a teenage boy and an adult female woman having a relationship. You can only stretch that so far. Like, it's not the most profound story that he's created, sorry. But once again, I really enjoy Licorice Pizza. I think the hate and the backlash it got a few years ago was very unjustified, and I think people kind of overreacted. That's just my personal opinion about the film. I enjoy it, I love it. If you like Paul Thomas Anderson's films, I highly recommend checking out Licorice Pizza. It's a very, very good film. We're going to move on to the truly original tier. These are the films that I think you can't compare to other films just because they're so unique and original that it's hard to even make the comparison. I felt like these films came from a personal place in him, and I felt like he did some very clever things in terms of being a film director in these films. So that's why we're going to start with the bottom of the truly original tier, and the fourth film in the Paul Thomas Anderson ranking, The Master. The Master is about a naval veteran who arrives home from war unsettled and uncertain of his future until he is tantalized by the cause and its charismatic leader. So The Master is probably the film where I think Joaquin Phoenix delivers his best performance. I really am compelled by his performance throughout the film. Paul Thomas Anderson does a fantastic job with the camera work. Philip Seymour Hoffman also delivers a very fine, very professional performance. Amy Adams, of course, is amazing as always. The story structure is very compelling. We're following Joaquin Phoenix, and he's a very confused man, and he gets into all sorts of trouble, and then he stumbles upon Philip Seymour Hoffman. Their initial meeting, that scene is so strong because you don't know where it's leading or where it's going. You start to see Philip Seymour Hoffman's character slowly peeling back the layers of Joaquin Phoenix's character, who's introduced in a very crass and very odd way, where he's a sailor, but he definitely has some mental disturbances, and he definitely has minor erotic fixations. The film is very original. It's a very smart commentary on Scientology and cult leaders in general. The world that Paul Thomas Anderson creates in this film is so strong, and it's really honest. It's a very unique look into the world of these type of people. The ending is very strong because you don't realize what kind of movie you're watching until you see the credits roll at the very end, and you're able to reflect on Joaquin Phoenix's journey, learning and growing with him, and you're questioning whether or not he's learned anything, or what he's learned in the end you're still kind of puzzled about. So that leaves you to create so many different alternative scenarios and possibilities of what Paul Thomas Anderson was trying to achieve, which I think gives a whole nother life to the film. And I think that's something you should always try to achieve as a director. I love The Master. The film is very unique and original. The camera work is great. Paul Thomas Anderson is great. Joaquin Phoenix is great. Please go check out The Master. The top of the truly original tier and the third film in our ranking is Magnolia. Magnolia is an epic mosaic of
interrelated characters in search of love, forgiveness, and meaning in the San Fernando Valley. Magnolia might have the most interesting story structure throughout all of Paul Thomas Anderson's filmography. It's his biggest ensemble film. There's no one main character per se. There's multiple main characters, and that's his only film that I think does that. And I think that's very effective and goes with the story structure through the film, because throughout the film you realize that what Paul Thomas Anderson was going for is a grand world that was interconnected in some sort of odd roundabout way, and how all these different storylines end up crossing and intersecting at very pivotal moments in the characters' journeys and lives. But they intersect so incidentally that it's very refreshing and honest, and you totally believe it, and you're kind of left jumping from one storyline to another. And when one storyline gets interesting, you realize it's leading to an interesting development in a different storyline. And I think that is so refreshing and exciting to watch. So you create so many different scenarios in your head throughout the film that it's very fun to just sit down and enjoy. And I think the length of the film actually adds to that, being appropriately long, being over 3 hours, but needing to be over 3 hours because there's so many characters and stories to go through. The movie has a lot of really good actors that I think do a fantastic job of playing off of each other. I like the twisting nature of the story. I think the film juggles the themes very nicely, and I think the pacing of the film is very strong. I also really think the ending of the film fits. I can see how some people dislike the ending of the film with the frogs raining, but I think that exemplifies the entire point of the randomness that Paul Thomas Anderson was trying to convey in this wild story that he's created with so many different characters. That to have a random occurrence of raining frogs come down on all of them, I think perfectly fits with just the bizarre nature of the story, and understanding that anything could happen to these characters at any time. He always tries to get that through your head in this film, and I think you definitely walk away thinking that near the end, which I think is a success on Paul Thomas Anderson's part. Tom Cruise gives one of his most memorable performances in his career in this film. I highly recommend you check out this film solely because of Tom Cruise's performance, because it's that good. The camera is very fluid in the film, and there's a certain sense of melancholy that he achieves, which I think is very effective for the film. So for all those reasons, Magnolia is at the top of the truly original tier, just because I'm so impressed how he was able to create such a vast story with so many characters, but you end up caring about the characters significantly for the small amount of time that they are on screen. I highly recommend you check out Magnolia. You won't regret it. The last tier on the Paul Thomas Anderson ranking is the personal favorites tier. This is pretty self-explanatory. These are the films that are my personal favorites that connect with me the most. There are only 2 films left, so let's just get right into it. The bottom of the personal favorites tier and the second film in the Paul Thomas Anderson ranking is Boogie Nights. Boogie Nights takes place back when sex was safe, pleasure was a business, and business was booming. An idealistic porn producer aspires to elevate his craft to an art when he discovers a hot young talent. Boogie Nights is a very exuberant, fun film. It's probably his most fun film. It's very exciting and very fast and very strong filmmaking. The scenery in Boogie Nights is very beautiful, and the storylines that the characters go through are exceedingly exciting and fun, and they only ramp up throughout the film. This is my favorite Mark Wahlberg film. I think this is easily his best film, Mark Wahlberg. He gives a pretty good performance. I'm not going to say it's the best performance ever, but it's a very good performance. Burt Reynolds gives a fantastic performance in this film as the porn director and producer. He's truly great in the film. Don Cheadle is very good in the film. Philip Seymour Hoffman's fantastic in the film, like always. He knocks out the park in this film. John C. Reilly is also very good in the film. They're all just fantastic actors. Paul Thomas Anderson really knows how to pick great actors for his films, and I think Boogie Nights might be his best semblance of actors he's put on screen. Each character in Boogie Nights has an arc, so even though in Magnolia all the characters have like a storyline, the characters in Boogie Nights have storylines as well. They're not as fleshed out as Mark Wahlberg's character, Dick Diggler's character's storyline, but they still have arcs and they still have dreams, and you still get that time with those characters to follow them, but they don't wrap up all neatly and nicely, which I think is very strong for the film, because not everyone's story has to end that way. You have all the fun in the first half, but then you have all the consequences in the second half. So you can have your cake, but you can't eat it too. The plot changes throughout with the characters over time, so it's about Mark Wahlberg's character, Dirk Diggler's journey through the porn industry, but over his career, his story and motivation changes throughout. So you have this very nice timeline that you have with Dirk Diggler, where you get to see his beginning, middle, and end, and how he changes as a character throughout the film. This is the film where I think Paul Thomas Anderson might have his best camera work. I really like the shot where the camera follows everyone around the pool. Philip Seymour Hoffman gives a rare moment of completely honest acting. The performances and Paul Thomas Anderson are my favorite part about Boogie Nights, so that's why Boogie Nights is just so good, because the story is fun but not silly, and Paul Thomas Anderson is a more polished filmmaker at this point. Even though this is right after Hard 8, I felt like Hard 8 was a good stepping stone to this film. He's much more polished in this film than he is in his previous film, so it's a huge upgrade, I think. I love Boogie Nights. It's one of my favorite Paul Thomas Anderson films. If you haven't seen Boogie Nights, please go watch it. You'll love it, trust me. The best Paul Thomas Anderson film, in my opinion, is none other than There Will Be Blood.
There Will Be Blood is a story of family, religion, hatred, oil, and madness, focusing on a turn-of-the-century prospector in the early days of the business.
There Will Be Blood is personally my favorite Daniel Day-Lewis performance, where he plays Daniel Plainview, the greedy oil tycoon. The film is so epic and classy, and it feels so important and grandiose. I think the beginning of the film is one of the best parts of the film, how you're able to tell the story through no dialogue 20 minutes into the film is super effective. You totally don't even realize that until after you watch the film and you look it up online, because you're just so compelled by what's happening and what you're seeing. Right in the very beginning, where Daniel Day-Lewis's character, Daniel Plainview, breaks his leg and he crawls out of the hole, and you just see the vast desert. You are totally immediately aware of the stakes that are involved in this film. It's the highest level of stakes you can possibly imagine, but he's able to succeed through grit and grind. But then with that comes a certain personality to him, where it's him or nothing, and he kind of mows down everyone in his path throughout the film. And when other characters try to offer him an olive branch through something, say religion, he rejects that. And it's a message that Paul Thomas Anderson tries to come across in terms of what's the best moral values for you, and what's the best way to live your life in a way that's good for you. And there's many different opinions as what it means to how to live and how to behave and what kind of person you're supposed to be. One character has one opinion who you're supposed to be and how you're supposed to behave, and another character has a different perspective. Seeing everyone's points of view, but then ultimately you're left kind of jarred by what happens near the end, and you're kind of left thinking about all the different themes throughout the film. The film makes you think. The film isn't clean. It doesn't have a clean-cut story, not a clean-cut ending, but it's very epic in scale, and the setting, production design
is truly fantastic. Paul Thomas Anderson probably has his best production design in There Will Be Blood because it's truly fantastic. And the score of the film is astonishingly good. I love the violin that is played for the score. It's truly epic. The story is completely original, and the story structure itself is completely original. Following this man, his peaks and valleys are so compelling, and the journey he goes through is so interesting and high stakes and drama ridden. The film oozes greatness in every frame. I love There Will Be Blood. It's one of my personal favorite movies. I think the film was robbed for Best Picture in 2007. I'm a huge fan of the film No Country for Old Men, but I think There Will Be Blood is a vastly superior film to No Country for Old Men. So I'm very disappointed with that outcome for the Oscars. It's probably one of the biggest close ones I could think of in terms of the Oscars getting it wrong, but the other films still being good. Paul Thomas Anderson is honestly overdue for an Oscar. That should have been his Oscar to win for There Will Be Blood, but they gave another Oscar to the Coen brothers. So we'll just have to roll with the punches, and we'll have to hope that they give Paul Thomas Anderson an Oscar for his next film. If you haven't seen There Will Be Blood, I suggest you stop this video right now because it's almost over and go immediately watch it. You won't regret it. The film is near flawless. Thank you for watching my Paul Thomas Anderson ranking, but before you leave, if you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you stay up to date on all new upcoming content. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.